Welcome to medieval Europe, where winter wasn't just cold, it was a literal nightmare. Imagine living in a time when surviving winter was like playing a game of Russian roulette with Mother Nature herself. No central heating, no electric blankets, definitely no Netflix. And if you were lucky, you might make it to spring. Well, buckle up. We're about to take you on a journey through one of history's most brutal seasons. We're talking about Europe between the 5th and 15th centuries, the Middle Ages, a time when kings ruled, peasants farmed, and everyone prayed that winter wouldn't kill them. Back then, winters were longer and colder than today. Scientists call it the Little Ice Age. Temperatures dropped so low that rivers froze solid enough to hold markets on them. People died from exposure just walking to their neighbour's house, and if you lived in places like England, France or Germany, you could expect snow from November to March, sometimes even April. This wasn't chilly. This was survival mode. First off, the weather was not on your side. Europe during this time was going through what we now call the Little Ice Age, which lasted roughly from the 14th to the 19th century. Winters were harsher, summers cooler, crops failed more often, famine was common. In some years, entire harvests were ruined by frost that came too early or stayed too late. So imagine trying to survive when your food supply was already limited and then winter hit. Snow piled high, roads vanished under ice, travel became nearly impossible. Even animals suffered. Chickens stopped laying eggs, cows gave less milk, and horses slipped on frozen paths. It was a world built for summer, not for winter. Now, let's talk about the biggest problem of all. Medieval people had no tech, like none. No electricity, no gas heaters, no microwaves to warm up leftovers. You want heat? Build a fire. You want light? Light a candle. You want to stay dry? Hope your roof doesn't leak. Modern humans complain about the AC breaking. Back then, they complained about their fingers falling off. And don't get me started on clothing. You thought your grandma's wool sweater was itchy? Try wearing layers of scratchy wool all day, every day. Gloves? That was a luxury item. Most people just wrapped their hands in cloth or animal hide if they were lucky. But here's the thing, medieval people didn't just suffer physically, they also suffered mentally. Winter wasn't just cold, it was scary. They believed in spirits, demons, gods of frost and darkness. Some villages held rituals to ward off evil, like hanging cats upside down in doorways, or burning special herbs to keep ghosts away. Because hey, if science couldn't explain why people were freezing to death, maybe magic could. They blamed witches, cursed lands, angry gods. And when someone died of hypothermia or pneumonia, that wasn't bad luck, that was punishment. So what did daily life look like in the dead of winter? Not fun. Farmers couldn't plough fields because the ground was frozen. Hunters couldn't find animals because they'd either hibernated or migrated. Fishermen couldn't fish because the rivers were covered in ice. So what did people do? They sat around, a lot. They huddled together for warmth, slept in the same room as their livestock, played dice games, told stories, prayed. Sometimes they got cabin fever. Imagine being stuck in a small wooden hut with 10 other people, 3 goats and no showers. Sound cozy? Yeah, not really. Food was another huge issue. There was no refrigeration, so whatever you stored in autumn had to last until spring. If you ran out, you starved. Or worse, you tried to eat things that weren't exactly edible. Tree bark, grass, animal fat. And forget about fresh veggies, anything green had long since rotted away. So vitamin deficiencies were common. Scurvy, rickets, malnutrition, especially among children. And guess what? When food ran low, violence increased. People stole bread, broke into storage houses, fought over scraps. Winter wasn't just brutal on the body, it was brutal on society. Disease thrived in winter. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, typhus. With no medicine, no antibiotics, and no hospitals, getting sick meant one thing. You hoped you got better, or you prepared to die. Frostbite was common fingers, toes, noses, all at risk of turning black and rotting off. Hypothermia was a real threat, especially for children and the elderly. And if you were poor, you didn't get to rest. You still had to work chopping wood, feeding animals, fetching water from frozen wells. Winter didn't care if you were tired. Winter didn't care if you were sick. Winter just showed up and took what it wanted. So yeah, medieval winters were brutal. Not just cold, not just inconvenient. They were dangerous, deadly, unforgiving. And yet, people survived. Somehow, they adapted. They endured. They told stories. And those stories are how we know what they went through. Next time, we'll explore how they tried to survive indoors and how their homes actually made things worse. Spoiler, medieval houses leaked wind like sieves. You made it through winter. Barely. But guess what? Even your house was against you. Medieval homes weren't built for comfort, they were built to keep the rain out. Maybe. Welcome back to our series on medieval winters, where we explore how even your shelter failed you when you needed it most. Let's talk about houses that leaked wind like sieves, fireplaces that filled your home with smoke, and why your goat might have been your best friend. Imagine waking up in a small wooden hut somewhere in medieval Europe. The air is cold. Your breath hangs in the air like fog. Snow drifts through cracks in the wall. Your bed? A pile of straw covered in thin wool blankets. And your roommate? Probably a goat. That's right. Many medieval peasants didn't just live with their families, they lived with their livestock. Why? Because body heat was precious and warmth was rare. So, if you wanted to survive the night without freezing to death, you did whatever it took, even if it meant sleeping next to a cow. Now let's talk about the actual construction of these homes, because house might be too generous a word. Most people lived in wattle and daub homes, basically sticks and mud packed together. Great for summer, terrible for winter. These homes had thin walls, leaky roofs, gaps between stones or wood planks, no insulation whatsoever. Think of it as nature's air conditioning, except it only worked in one direction. In wind, snow, and cold would pour in from every angle, making indoor life almost as miserable as outdoor life. And if you were lucky enough to have stone walls, congrats! Now you get to enjoy the joy of damp, freezing air soaking into your bones like a sad, historical spa treatment. Some homes had thatched roofs, layers of dry grass or reeds. They looked rustic and charming until it rained. Then they became soggy sponges, dripping water onto your floor like your house was crying. So, how did people stay warm? Fire, of course. Except fire came with its own set of problems. Rich folks had actual fireplaces, which sounds nice until you realise they smoked up the whole house. Poor folks had open hearths, basically a pile of burning logs in the middle of the room. There was no chimney, there was only smoke. And so much coughing. Picture this. You're trying to sleep, but the air is thick with smoke, your eyes are watering, and your nose won't stop running. This wasn't just winter survival, it was basic endurance training. And don't forget the danger of falling asleep too close to the fire. Because nothing says medieval life like waking up to your hair on fire. Some homes had smoke holes in the roof, but those were more like suggestions than solutions. They helped a little, but mostly just made your house smell like burnt wood and regret. Now, here's something you probably didn't expect. Many medieval families shared their homes with animals. Goats, pigs, chickens, they all moved indoors during winter. Why? Because body heat was precious. If you had a cow sleeping next to you, at least you wouldn't freeze to death. Was it gross? Absolutely. Did it smell terrible? Without a doubt. But hey, survival isn't glamorous. It meant fewer mouths to feed outside and more warmth inside. So while it might sound absurd today, medieval peasants knew one thing. Sometimes your best roommate is a smelly farm animal. Animals also protected food stores. Chickens laid eggs when they weren't frozen, pigs could eat scraps, and cows provided milk when they weren't hibernating from the cold. So yes, living with animals was weird, but it was also practical. So what did daily life look like inside these drafty, smoky, goat-filled homes? Not fun. You couldn't cook easily, fire was unreliable. You couldn't read, there was no electricity, no light bulbs, just flickering candlelight. You couldn't clean, washing required hot water, which was a luxury. So everyone smelled like sweat, smoke, and livestock. Families stayed inside most of the day, doing simple chores, mending clothes, sharpening tools, grinding grain, telling stories by firelight, and if you were lucky, you got to play dice games or sing songs around the fire. But most of the time, you were just waiting for spring. But here's the thing, staying indoors didn't mean safety. In fact, it came with its own dangers. Smoke inhalation was common. So was pneumonia from being cooped up with 10 other people and 3 goats. Sickness spread fast, and with no medicine, one sneeze could turn into a death sentence. Frostbite still happened even inside. Your fingers and toes would go numb from the cold, then black, then gone. And don't even get me started on the lack of ventilation. Carbon monoxide poisoning? A real threat. Sometimes, the house that kept you warm also quietly killed you. And hygiene? Forget it. No showers, No soap, just a bucket of icy water and hope. So yeah, medieval homes were cozy in theory, but deadly in practice. Of course, not everyone suffered the same way. The rich had better homes, stone castles with proper fireplaces, tapestries on the walls for insulation, and multiple rooms to rotate between for warmth. They had servants to gather firewood, stoke the flames, and bring warm drinks. Peasants had none of that. They had a single room, a leaky roof, and a pig named Steve. Even nobility struggled with the cold, but they had options. They could retreat to warmer parts of the castle. They could afford extra blankets, fur-lined robes, or even heated metal beds called warming pans. Yes, seriously, some people slept with hot coals tucked under their sheets. So while both classes felt the bite of winter, only the wealthy could do something about it. Despite all this, people survived. Somehow, they found ways to adapt, to endure, and to make the most of impossible conditions. They used hay bales as makeshift insulation. They hung blankets over windows to block drafts. They burned dung when firewood ran out. And yes, they hugged each other, a lot. Huddling together for warmth was one of the most effective ways to survive a medieval winter. Whole families would sleep in one bed. Sometimes even strangers would share space for warmth. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't private, but it kept them alive. So yeah, medieval houses were not designed for comfort. They were survival tools, barely. But somehow, people adapted. They found ways to survive the cold, the smoke, and the goat roommates. They huddled together, told stories, and waited for spring. Winter was brutal. But humans are resilient. Even with a drafty house and a pig in the corner, people made it through. You made it through winter. Barely. But guess what? Even your clothes were against you. Medieval fashion wasn't about style, it was about survival. And most of the time, it failed. Welcome back to our series on medieval winters, where we explore how even your wardrobe tried to kill you. Let's talk about wool that itched like sandpaper, gloves that didn't exist, and why burning dung under your robe was considered high fashion. Imagine living in a time when staying warm was a full-time job. There were no puffer jackets, no thermal socks, definitely no heated gloves. If you lived in medieval Europe, your entire day revolved around trying not to freeze to death. So what did people wear? Wool, more wool. And if you were lucky, fur. But here's the kicker. None of it actually worked very well. In fact, most clothing made winter worse. It was uncomfortable, ineffective, and sometimes even dangerous. Let's take a deep dive into medieval fashion, or as I like to call it, survival by fabric. So let's start with the basics. What did people actually wear in winter? For peasants, it was simple. Undergarments, usually linen or rough wool. Outerwear, thick wool tunics, cloaks and hoods. Footwear, wooden-soled shoes wrapped in cloth or leather. Accessories, hats made of wool or fur, if you were lucky. Nobles had more options. Fur-lined coats, leather boots, silk underlayers, fancy hats that looked nice but did nothing for warmth. But here's the problem. Most of this clothing was either too thin, too scratchy, or just plain useless in freezing temperatures. Wool was itchy, hats fell off, gloves didn't really exist. So if you wanted to stay warm, you had two choices: bundle up like a mummy or freeze. Now let's talk about the star of medieval fashion, wool. You thought your grandma's sweater was itchy? Try wearing layers of coarse wool all day, every day. No soft cotton, no stretchy fabrics, just thick, stiff, sandpaper-like wool that rubbed your skin raw. And don't get me started on the smell. After weeks without washing, because hot water was a luxury, wool garments turned into walking science experiments. People wore the same outfits for months at a time, scratching, sneezing, and coughing from the dust and dirt trapped inside. Wool may have been warm, but it came at a cost. Frostbite wasn't optional, it was mandatory, because unless you were nobility, gloves simply didn't exist. Peasants went barehanded through snow-covered fields, chopping wood, feeding animals, and building fires, all with fingers numb from the cold. And feet? Don't even ask. Shoes were wooden soles tied to your feet with leather straps. They soaked up snow like sponges and gave zero insulation. So by midwinter, most people had frostbitten toes, if they still had toes at all. Even nobles struggle. Their fancy boots might look good, but they weren't waterproof. So while they stayed warmer than peasants, they still walked around with wet socks and frozen feet. Fashion fail or survival strategy? Medieval people got creative, sometimes weirdly so. Some peasants burned animal dung under their robes for warmth. Others stuffed hay or straw into their clothes like homemade insulation. And yes, some people carried warming pans, which were basically little metal baskets filled with hot coals tucked under their skirts or blankets. Sounds cozy, right? Until you realize those coals could set your dress on fire. So while these ideas were inventive, they were also kind of insane. Winter fashion wasn't about looking good, it was about surviving long enough to see spring. Men froze. Women froze twice as much, once from the cold and twice from the corset. Women wore long dresses made of heavy wool, often with tight waistlines that restricted breathing and circulation. They couldn't move freely, they couldn't layer properly, and they definitely couldn't work outdoors without freezing solid. Men had it slightly better, looser tunics, easier access to extra layers, and fewer restrictions. But they still suffered from the same issues: poor insulation, lack of gloves, and inadequate footwear. So whether you were male or female, winter meant suffering just in different ways. Clothing that didn't help often made things worse. Frostbite was common fingers, toes, noses, skin infections from constant rubbing of wool, hypothermia after long days outside. And then there was the worst enemy of all, the cold wind. With no zippers, no Velcro, and no elastic, keeping clothes snug was nearly impossible. So wind blew right in, chilling you to the bone no matter how many layers you wore. Surviving winter meant not just dressing warmly, it meant dressing smart, which most people didn't. Despite all this, people survived. Somehow, they found ways to adapt, to endure, and to make the most of impossible conditions. They wrapped themselves in hay or animal hides. They shared body heat with livestock. They used hot stones or warming pans under blankets. And most importantly, they huddled together. Whole families would sleep in one bed. Sometimes even strangers would share space for warmth. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't private. But it kept them alive. So yeah, medieval clothing was not designed for comfort. It was survival gear. Barely. But somehow, people adapted. They found ways to survive the cold, the itchiness, and the complete lack of gloves. They bundled up, told stories, and waited for spring. Winter was brutal, but humans are resilient. Even with a scratchy outfit and no socks, people made it through. You made it through the cold. You survived the scratchy wool and drafty houses. But guess what? Now you're starving. Welcome to medieval Europe, where winter didn't just freeze your fingers, it starved your stomach. In this episode of Why Medieval Winters Were Brutal, we're diving into one of the most terrifying parts of winter survival: food shortages. And yes, people really did eat tree bark. Imagine a world without freezers, no refrigerators, no pantries full of snacks. If you lived in medieval Europe, what you ate in winter depended entirely on what you managed to store back in autumn. No canning, no vacuum sealing, just barrels, salt, and hope. And if you ran out, well, let's just say people got creative. So how did people keep food from rotting or freezing solid? They used simple techniques passed down for generations. Salted meat hung in cool cellars, pickled vegetables in vinegar or brine, dried fruits and grains stored in sacks, root cellars dug underground to keep things cool but not freezing. But none of these were perfect. Mice invaded storage rooms, mold grew on bread, meat rotted, and once the supply ran out, well, that's when things got scary. So what was dinner like in the middle of winter? Not fun. Most people ate stale bread, if they had any left, pickled cabbage, which tasted worse than it sounds, salted fish or pork, so salty it made you thirsty, porridge made from oats or barley, occasional cheese, if they were lucky, fresh veggies, gone by December, fruit, only dried apples or raisins, and milk, only if your cow hadn't frozen to death already. It wasn't just bland, it was nutritionally disastrous. Vitamin C? Non-existent. Fresh protein? Rare. So scurvy, malnutrition, and weakness were common. Once the barrels were empty and the sacks were bare, people panicked. Starvation spread like fire. Children were hit hardest. Older villagers often gave up their rations to younger ones. Some villages held food-sharing systems. Others turned violent. Hunger led to theft, riots, and even murder. Farmers raided storage houses. Peasants stole from nobles. And in extreme cases, people turned to darker options. So what happens when you run out of food and winter is still going strong? You improvise. Medieval peasants did some wild stuff. Tree bark scraped and boiled into a paste. Grass and moss mixed with water, animal fat, melted and eaten raw. Hay soup, yes, really. Some people even ate dead livestock, even if it had died weeks ago. Rodents caught in storage bins, frozen berries found under snow, and no, it didn't taste good. But hey, at least it kept you alive, maybe. Starvation didn't just make people weak, it made them sick. Without proper nutrients, immune systems crashed. Pneumonia, dysentery, and infections spread like wildfire. Scurvy caused teeth to fall out. Rickets made bones brittle. And frostbite healed slower because the body had no energy to fight it. Winter wasn't just brutal on the body. It was brutal on the immune system. And for many, it was the final blow. Of course, not everyone suffered the same way. Nobles had more food stores. They had wine cellars, dried meats and spices, fresh bread baked daily, even imported goods from warmer regions. Peasants had mouldy bread and pickled cabbage. Sometimes they were forced to sell tools or clothes just to buy a few days' worth of food. And if you were poor and hungry, you either begged or you stole. Despite all this, people survived. Somehow, they found ways to adapt, to endure, and to make the most of impossible conditions. They hunted animals in late fall to stock up, foraged for roots and nuts before snow covered the land, shared food within families and communities, used herbs and spices to preserve what little they had, and sometimes they prayed, because when you're freezing, starving, and coughing blood, faith might be the only thing keeping you going. So yeah, medieval winters weren't just about surviving the cold. They were about surviving hunger. From pickled cabbage to tree bark, people did whatever it took to live. And somehow they made it through, even with empty bellies and shaking hands. Winter was brutal, but humans are resilient. Even with nothing to eat, people made it to spring. You made it through the cold. You survived the scratchy wool, drafty houses, and starvation diet. But guess what? Winter wasn't done with you yet. Welcome back to our series on medieval winters, where we're diving into one of the most terrifying parts of survival, the health risks of freezing to death. From frostbitten fingers to full-body shutdowns, this episode is about how winter didn't just make you shiver. It made you die. Imagine being outside in the middle of winter, wearing nothing but layers of wool and hope. No gloves, no thermals, definitely no hand warmers. Your fingers start to tingle, then go numb. Your toes feel like blocks of ice. And before long, your whole body starts shutting down. This wasn't just uncomfortable, this was dangerous. Even deadly. Frostbite wasn't rare, it was expected. Medieval peasants suffered from it every winter. It started with numbness, then pain, then blackened skin, and finally, loss of limbs, or worse. People woke up to find their fingers or toes had turned black overnight. There was no treatment, no warming creams, no emergency rooms. So they waited. and hoped their body wouldn't rot from the outside in. Frostbite might steal your fingers, but hypothermia steals your life. When your body temperature drops below 95 degrees Fahrenheit, 35 degrees Celsius, things get real. Shivering stops, muscles stiffen, speech slurs, and eventually you fall asleep and never wake up. Medieval people didn't understand this. They thought you were just too tired, so they let victims sleep right into the afterlife. Cold air plus crowded homes equals sickness city. With no ventilation, families huddled together in smoky, damp homes. One cough could spread across the entire village. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, bronchitis, all common, all deadly, and all thriving in the cold, dark months of winter. Children died first, then the elderly, then anyone already weakened by hunger or exhaustion. Winter wasn't just cold, it was a killer. So how did people treat illness? Well, if you were lucky enough to be rich, maybe you got some herbal tea and prayers. If you were poor, you got leeches, or bloodletting, or someone rubbed snow on your face and told you to man up. There was no understanding of germs, no antibiotics, no vaccines, just superstition and suffering. Spoiler, not the nobles. Rich folks had fireplaces, fur-lined robes, and servants to keep them warm. Peasants had none of that. Children, the elderly, and the sick were hit hardest. Babies froze to death in cribs. Old men passed out in the snow. Sick villagers were left behind when families fled villages for warmer shelter. Winter didn't care who you were. It only cared how long you could survive it. Physical danger wasn't the only threat. Mental health took a beating too. No sunlight, no fresh food, no escape from your family. Depression, anxiety, cabin fever. People went mad from isolation. Some lost their minds entirely. Others believed they were cursed. And some simply gave up. Despite all this, people survived. Somehow, they found ways to adapt, to endure, and to make the most of impossible conditions. They shared body heat with animals and strangers, built makeshift beds with hay and straw, used warming pans filled with hot coals, prayed a lot. Winter was brutal, but humans are resilient. Even with frozen fingers and weak lungs, people made it to spring. So yeah, medieval winters weren't just cold. They were deadly. From frostbite to pneumonia, from starvation to hypothermia, winter was a battlefield. And many didn't make it, but somehow many did. Winter was brutal, but humans are tougher than you think. You made it inside. You survived the scratchy wool, drafty houses, starvation diet, and frostbitten fingers. But guess what? Sometimes you had to go outside. Welcome back to our series on medieval winters, where we explore how people tried and failed to survive outdoors in freezing temperatures. From falling into frozen rivers to getting buried under snowdrifts, This episode is about the brave, the desperate, and the stupidly cold. Imagine stepping outside your house in medieval Europe. No thermals, no waterproof boots, definitely no gloves. Just wool, hope, and maybe a scarf made of hay. The wind sliced through your clothes like a rusty sword. Your breath turned to ice mid-air. And if you weren't careful, you wouldn't be coming back inside. Going outside wasn't just inconvenient. It was dangerous, even deadly. Food was scarce. So some peasants braved the cold to hunt. Big mistake. Animals hibernated or migrated. Traps froze shut. Arrows snapped in the cold. And sometimes the hunter became the hunted. Wolves got bold in winter. They followed villagers home, hoping for scraps. And if you fell asleep in the woods, you might wake up with a new best friend named Frostbite. Farmers didn't get a break just because it was winter. Fields were rock hard, ploughs bounced off the ground. Crops died in the frost. Livestock starved, and shovels broke trying to dig through ice. Some farmers gave up entirely. Others tried to work anyway, only to lose fingers, toes, or worse. Winter didn't care if you needed food. It only cared how long you could survive it. Need to travel somewhere? Too bad. Rivers froze solid until someone stepped on them and drowned. Roads vanished under snowdrifts. And walking for hours meant risking hypothermia or getting lost in a blizzard. People tied ropes between travelers so they wouldn't get separated. Some carried torches to see at night. Others just prayed they'd make it before sunrise. Spoiler, many didn't. Most armies stopped fighting in winter because who wants to swing a sword when your hands are frozen stiff? But not everyone quit. Some kings kept attacking. Why? Because desperation makes people do dumb things. Knights slipped on ice. Arrows cracked in the cold. And soldiers died from exposure more than enemy blades. Winter was the real killer. When staying warm wasn't an option, people got creative. Some buried themselves in hay to stay warm, lit small fires in the woods and slept nearby, rubbed snow on their skin to warm up, drank alcohol to feel less cold. Spoiler, didn't help long term. None of these worked very well, but hey, at least they tried. Kids played in the snow until they didn't. Some wandered too far and never came back. Others sat by fires too long and caught their clothes on fire. And let's not forget the animals. Chickens froze to roosting poles, cows refused to move, and horses slipped on ice like slapstick comedians. Winter was brutal for everyone, even goats. Despite all this, people helped each other. Villages built shelters for travelers. Neighbors dug each other out of snowdrifts. And strangers shared warmth when they could. Winter was cruel, but humans, still kind. So yeah, going outside in medieval winter was like playing Russian roulette with Mother Nature. Sometimes you made it. Sometimes you didn't. But somehow, people still found ways to survive. Even in the coldest, darkest months. You made it through the cold. You survived the scratchy wool, drafty houses, starvation diet, and frost-bitten fingers. And somehow, you're still alive. But guess what? People didn't just suffer through winter. They partied. Welcome back to our series on medieval winters, where we explore how people celebrated in the middle of one of the harshest seasons known to humanity. From bonfires to drunken feasts, this episode is about how humans refuse to let winter kill their vibe. Imagine living in a time when winter meant weeks of darkness, cold, hunger, and isolation. No Netflix, no lights, definitely no central heating. So what did people do to stay sane? They threw parties. Big ones. Festivals were more than fun, they were survival tools. A way to bond, share food, and remind everyone that spring was coming. Because without hope, winter could break your mind faster than it broke your toes. Before Christianity, many cultures celebrated the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, with wild festivals. The Norse had Yule, complete with giant bonfires and drinking competitions. The Romans had Saturnalia, where slaves got to boss around their masters for a few days, and everyone drank until they collapsed. Even the Celts had Imbolc, marking the first signs of spring. These weren't just holidays, they were survival tactics. Because if you didn't have something to look forward to, winter might just finish you off. Christmas wasn't always about presents and Santa. In medieval Europe, it was about surviving long enough to enjoy a rare feast. Nobles dined on roasted boar, spiced wine, and sugary pastries. Peasants got whatever meat they had left, often salted pork or fish. But for a few days, everyone tried to forget the cold and enjoy themselves. There were dances, songs, games, and yes, even early versions of caroling. Of course, not everyone celebrated. Some thought partying was sinful. Others just couldn't afford it. But for those who could, it was a chance to feel human again. When the sun disappeared for months, people created their own light. Bonfires lit up villages across Europe. People danced, sang, and told stories under the stars. Music was simple drums, flutes, and lutes, but it brought joy all the same. And if you were lucky enough to have a minstrel visit your village, that was the medieval version of a concert. These gatherings weren't just fun, they were essential. They kept people connected. They reminded them they weren't alone. And most importantly, they gave them something to live for. Of course, medieval people also used festivals as an excuse to be weird. They believed burning special herbs would ward off evil spirits. Hanging evergreen branches inside kept bad luck away, and maybe bugs too. Some villages performed strange plays where someone died and then came back to life, probably scaring the kids half to death. One of the weirdest traditions, hanging cats upside down in doorways. Yes, really. They thought it would protect against evil spirits. Spoiler, it didn't work. But hey, at least it made the cat famous. If you think Halloween is weird, wait till you hear about medieval mummers. Groups of villagers dressed up in bizarre costumes and travelled from house to house, performing short plays and asking for food or money. Sometimes they'd reenact legends like St. George slaying a dragon. Other times, they'd just make noise and pretend to die dramatically. It was the medieval version of trick-or-treating, but with more singing and less candy. These performances lifted spirits. They gave people something to look forward to. And honestly, anything to distract from the fact that your feet were frozen and your dinner was pickled cabbage. Festivals also meant one thing: alcohol. Lots of it. Mead, ale, spiced wine, whatever they could brew before winter hit. For a few days, people forgot their problems and drank themselves into temporary happiness. Gambling tables popped up in every village square. Dice games, betting on animals, and even fake jousting matches filled the streets. Of course, things got out of hand. Fights broke out, romances bloomed, and sometimes people fell into snowdrifts mid-party. But hey, at least they were warm for a little while. And it wasn't just Europe. All over the world, people celebrated winter with unique traditions. The Chinese celebrated Dongji Festival, eating dumplings and honoring ancestors. The Japanese celebrated Shogatsu, cleaning homes and welcoming new beginnings. In Scandinavia, Yule, was all about feasting, sacrifices, and hoping Odin wouldn't haunt your dream. Winter was brutal everywhere. But somehow, humans found ways to celebrate together. So yeah, medieval winters were brutal. But people still found ways to celebrate. Through firelight, music, dance, and a little bit of alcohol, they fought back against the cold, the dark, and the despair. Festivals weren't just fun. They were survival strategies. They reminded people they weren't alone, and that spring was always just around the corner. Winter was brutal. Medieval people froze, starved, got sick, and sometimes ate tree bark just to survive. And yet, they made it through. Welcome to the final episode of Why Medieval Winters Were Brutal. In this last chapter, we're stepping out of the snowstorm and into the present day to reflect on what we've learned, how far we've come, and what we might still be missing from the past. Because, believe it or not, maybe there's something we can learn from peasants who lived without central heating. Imagine living in a time when your only source of heat came from burning wood. Your only light came from candles or fire. Your only way to stay warm was to huddle together like penguins. And your only entertainment? Stories by firelight. That was medieval life. No microwaves, no heaters, definitely no heated car seats. But somehow, people survived. Not just physically, but mentally. And they did it with grit, humour, and a surprising amount of goat roommates. Let's get real. We have it so much better now. Central heating? Check. Food available year-round? Double check. Medical care that doesn't involve rubbing snow on your face? Yes, please. We don't have to worry about frostbite while walking to work. We don't eat hay soup because we're starving. We don't hang cats upside down to ward off evil spirits. Though honestly, that part sounds fun. But here's the kicker. Even with all our tech and convenience, we still complain about winter. So maybe we could take a page from the medieval playbook. One thing medieval people had that we often forget: community. They told stories to pass the time. They shared warmth, food, and shelter. They celebrated small victories like surviving another night without freezing to death. Today, we live in isolated homes, scroll endlessly on phones, and rarely talk to our neighbours. Maybe we should bring back some of those old traditions, like gathering around a fire, sharing meals, telling stories, or just checking in on each other. Because if medieval people could survive a winter with no gloves and one potato, we can at least text our friends once in a while. Surviving medieval winters took creativity. They used hay as insulation. They carried hot coals under blankets. They burned dung for warmth. None of it was perfect, but it worked. Today, we have heaters, coats, and gloves. But do we know how to adapt? Do we know how to fix things ourselves? Do we know how to survive without electricity? Medieval people didn't have Google to tell them what to do. They had to figure it out. And that kind of resilience is worth remembering. We've gained so much since medieval times: technology, medicine, comfort. But we've also lost something: simplicity, connection, a sense of wonder. Back then, every meal was special. Every flame was precious. Every sunrise meant spring was closer. Now, we hit heat on our thermostat and go back to scrolling. Maybe we don't need to live like medieval peasants, but maybe we can appreciate what we have a little more. History isn't just dates and kings. It's about understanding what humans are capable of. It's about seeing how far we've come and how much further we can go. Learning about medieval winters reminds us of how fragile life can be, how important community is, how powerful hope can be, and most of all, how lucky we are to not have to rub snow on our faces to stay warm. So, if you were dropped into medieval Europe tomorrow, would you survive? Would you burn dung for warmth? Would you share a bed with a goat? Would you risk eating tree bark just to avoid starvation? Some of you might. Others would probably die within a week. But either way, it's worth thinking about, because the past shows us what's possible. Even in the coldest, darkest time, medieval winters were brutal. There's no sugarcoating it. People suffered, people died, people ate weird things, but they also endured. They adapted. They told stories, and somehow they made it to spring. Winter tested them. It broke many, but it also shaped them. And in doing so, it helped build the world we live in today. Thanks for joining me on this journey through medieval winters. From frostbitten toes to bonfires in blizzards, we've explored the cold, the hunger, the danger, and the humanity. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching, for listening, and for caring enough to learn from the past. Remember, winter may be cold, but humans are warmer. Thanks for watching the final episode of Why Medieval Winters Were Brutal. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, survival, and goat roommates, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Want to see more content like this? Drop a comment below. Tell us what historical era you'd want to explore next. Until next time, stay warm, stay curious, and remember, always keep a goat nearby.